So I think we face each other. Leah, do we look good facing each other?
I think so.
I feel like we do. Riley Mulherkar.
And then Chris can go right here.
Exactly. He's going to squeeze him right
We're
here.
holding space for Chris.
I love that. I wore my most Riley jacket today.
And I fell right into the trap.
And
Because as soon as I saw you, I said, great jacket.
You were like, and it's so funny when I put it on, I was like, this could backfire. You could walk in wearing
with
the
that
same
exact jacket,
which I think
we came so close.
But I figured you'd be gig ready because you're playing tonight. And where you're playing as part of the Manhattan Marathon at Winter Jazzfest.
Manhattan Marathon Winter Jazzfest, Zinc Bar.
Yes.
We're going to be there at 8:30.
Okay.
As is the case with all venues, anytime you get there, there's going to be great music going on. But yeah, if you want to catch our set, we'll be there 8:30.
That's why I wanted you here today.
Okay.
I didn't want you here tomorrow telling me how great it was. I wanted you here today telling me what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And more to the point, do we sound good? Oh, it might not be on the Facebook. Okay, maybe we'll post it after the fact. I mean, it's on Instagram. I can see that it's on Instagram.
Hello, Instagram.
You can go to the Instagram, Leo Sidran's Instagram. It's live.
Great.
That much I know.
And the Third Story Pod.
And the Third Story Pod, no. And I'll tell you why. I have far fewer followers.
Everyone wants Leo.
They want Leo.
They don't want Third Story Pod.
That's a real thing. And I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah.
You maybe have been through this yourself because you, for example, a big part of your reputation is as a member of the Westerlies.
Right.
And I want to acknowledge also, even though it's Winter Jazz Fest, there's a lot of things going on in New York this weekend.
Yeah.
Are you playing with the Westerlies tomorrow?
Westerlies, yeah, I'll be with the Westerlies tomorrow, uptown at Unity Jazz Festival as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much happening. It would be
wild.
silly to try to just focus on a little of it. It's like trying to capture the river in a cup. You know, you can't do it. It's just flowing. But maybe as a member of the Westerlies, you went through this where you had so much more reach through the network of the Westerlies than you did through your direct network as Riley. Mm-hmm. And you have to decide, how do I want to reach people?
But I mean, in your case, I think it's totally natural because the podcast is just one extension of the things that you do.
Yeah.
So for people to be able to follow you, and one day it might be podcast content, interviews, other days it might be your music, other days, who knows what else you're going to be putting on there. But I think it's totally a natural fit.
I'm trying to interview you, but I do want to speak to this actually, because there has been a part of me for years that has thought, well, I don't want to burden the people that like the podcast with my own music, and I don't want to burden the people that like my own music with the podcast. Over time, I think I've come to understand those are probably the same people.
Right.
But for the longest time, my sensibility was, you might enjoy my podcast conversation with Riley, and it doesn't mean you want to hear about my new single.
Right. But I think, I think people buy into the whole package of Leo. They want everything. And that's, I think also, if we can just talk about you instead of talking about me, what's cool about the podcast is that all that stuff comes up and comes through, and that's why your conversations are unique. And then there's also so much crossover in terms of people you work with coming onto the podcast, having conversations with them. I just think it's more holistic than like any one avenue.
We can't, in the same way that you can't be contained or confined by Winter Jazz Fest because you're playing uptown at Unity tomorrow. None of us are contained by one thing that we do. We contain multitudes. And I think, I appreciate you saying that. And I think you are a perfect example because the last time I saw you was at my birthday gig at Barbez in our neighborhood. You sat in. But it is true that we're on Instagram Live, I believe, right now, because that's where we can reach more people. And I wanted to reach as many people as possible because, it's funny. We talked for the podcast, for the Third Story podcast, at the beginning of 2024.
Right.
Or spring.
Almost a year ago, yeah.
At that time, your record had not really come out or was about to come out, maybe had just come out. People hadn't really heard it.
Right.
You didn't know how you were going to perform it.
Yeah.
You were curious, maybe even a little nervous about how it would be received.
Mm-hmm.
Your community is a jazz community, but the record doesn't sound like a lot of jazz records. And so it was, the unknown. You were facing down the unknown. And that's why I wanted to reconnect with you right now, because I feel a kind of personal vested interest in the outcome of what happened, since I was like there with you right before the record came out. Interestingly, I sat on our interview until only a few months ago. So the podcast that we did was released September or something.
Yeah.
So it's a little fresher from a point of view of people that had heard our conversation, if they did. But the reality is it's almost a year since we spoke.
Right.
The album showed up on so many best of lists. It was celebrated, and I don't know what metrics somebody would use to decide if something is a success or not, but for me, watching it from arm's length, it seems like it was an enormous success. It is
Thank you.
And I'm so happy for you.
No, I really appreciate that. And also I still just so appreciate in that conversation, before a lot of people had heard it, talking to you about it, and the way that you sat down with it and listened to it and really tried to hear what we were saying with it. It meant the world to me. And that's been the most gratifying part of this whole process, the whole past year, is, we spent a lot of time crafting every single sound on that thing, and knowing that all those little choices hit so many different people in different emotional ways. Sometimes the ways we intended, sometimes, you never know how where it's going to come into someone, where they're at in their life, whatever's going on, whether they're students or peers or just listeners. So that's been, the best part of the whole journey for me. And it's still an exciting part of the journey. It was my first record under my own name, and so a lot of people have no idea who I am, and it feels really wonderful to have something to share with them that feels like such a true representation of who I am and what I love and what I want to say.
Have you been surprised by what people, whether or not you knew them or not, how they reacted to it, or what their responses to it or their commentaries were about it?
I think sometimes it's hard to articulate exactly what may be surprising, but with this music, it puts me in a bit more of a vulnerable space. And so I think back to actually what's coming to mind now is I was in your hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, and we were on the road sharing this music live, and we were in this awesome club out there called the North Street Cabaret, and it was packed to the brims, and I totally immersed myself in this music, and you sort of, I often close my eyes when I play, and there's a sort of deep listening and presence that we're all trying to achieve on stage in the music. And so you sort of have this moment where you go into that zone and then you wake up out of it, and you have no idea what experience everyone around you had. And I remember that night in particular, just opening my eyes at the end of the night and seeing that we had actually all moved through that experience together. And that's the thing that fills me the most, is not necessarily even knowing what emotional experiences people are having with the record, but knowing that it's surprising them and putting them in a place where they're experiencing it in hopefully a way that is a much more emotional and deep state of listening than they might have thought they were going to encounter that evening.
Yeah. I want to hold some of these questions for Chris when he comes, because some of them, there's such a technical aspect. I mean, one of the things that came up when we spoke about the record last time was understanding that the music, and particularly that recording, was happening on a few levels. And one of the levels was a very sort of psychoacoustic level, where there are things that are happening in the way the sound is being treated. And I think we spoke after the fact, when you started to tour, about how audiences might not be aware that you are putting a bunch of sub bass into a room, for example, that they might not be expecting when they go hear jazz, and they don't know what's going on. They're not sure what they're hearing, but they realize that they're experiencing some sounds coming off of a stage, the same stage where they might have heard an acoustic jazz show the night before, and this is just feeling different to them. They're not sure why or how.
Yeah.
Do you think the sound of what you've been doing is part of that experience that you're talking about, of closing your eyes and the audience
I think so.
entering?
And when Chris gets here, and I wonder if we've heard from him yet.
No, still not.
Nothing yet. But he can speak to that because, in the first sessions we had for this album, one of the first things we did was just sampling sounds. So sampling sounds from my trumpet and creating vocabulary that we could then use to create instruments that then we could use to craft things that we wanted to say.
Right.
I remember, sitting in the studio with him and going through all these notes, going through all these different extended techniques and textures. And I love that stuff because I do think there's sometimes a manipulative element to it where we don't want people to necessarily be able to tell what exactly it is they're hearing. But not only is there a lot of intention behind it, but also usually the DNA of it comes from us.
Right.
Because it's, instruments that are us, but they're
manipulated,
yeah.
When you started to, I don't know what we should talk about before Chris gets here. We got to talk about, a lot of things that give him an opportunity to get involved here. Right. But I do know that you were curious how you were going to be able to play the music live. In a sense also because it was a record that took a long time to make. Mm-hmm. And it was, you had been patiently crafting and sculpting it and whatever. Yeah. And then suddenly you have to go and contain it into this present moment thing. Right. So what was the process of doing that?
It was sort of a coming together of two things. One was trying to use the record as a guide and saying we want to try to create a world that exists in the same world as the record. And so that means bringing some of the sounds in the record into the live show. It also means for me in my performance, allowing myself to lean into things that I found in the process of making the record that I wouldn't always think would have a place in a live setting, maybe because they seem so quiet or they seem so restrained or they seem so odd or weird or any number of things. So that was part of the process. And then the other part was accepting the freedom that comes from a live experience and the surprise and the improvisation. There are, in most of these arrangements, there are spaces where we made a decision on the record that was one thing, but if each player on stage doesn't have the freedom to make a different decision at any moment, then we're going to lose. It turns into something else that we don't want it to be. So.
That's what I was thinking about, because a record is a series of sort of spontaneously captured events that then are processed and revamped and recycled and done, a million things were done to them. But if you've been listening to that over the course of however many months and years that it took to make the record, they become sort of etched in stone.
Right.
Now you get back on stage and you return to the free-form version of that.
But I enjoyed that process of learning things from the album, because now the album exists as a separate thing from what we are, and we can use that as a North Star in certain ways, and we'll find things in live performance that will not be the thing that made the thing happen on the record, but it finds the same gesture or effect or emotional strain that the decision we made on the record found. So it pushes me in new ways, and as a trumpet player, it's so much fun to be able to really try to stretch the imagination of what I can do with the instrument.
Yeah. That's one of the things I was thinking about, like a week like this in New York, where you have multiple jazz festivals and events going on at the same time. I saw on social media that you were at Dizzy's last night. Allen Room, or
well, I was there in the day for Jazz Congress.
Oh, right.
And then that evening there was a celebration for the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation. Yeah. So it was sort of an insane night at Dizzy's. The front line was Wynton Branford and Terrence Blanchard, and Herlin Riley was on drums.
Yeah.
John Batiste came and played some piano. Joanne Brackeen was being honored. She played. So yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous.
It is. It's not like you need any reminder in New York of how deep the bench is and how rich it is with great music and musicians. Mm-hmm. But there are certain times when you just go, this is unbelievable what's happening here. The confluence of all these people. But for you, I mean, you're going to go and play tonight and do the Riley material with your band, and then tomorrow, something that you're accustomed to doing in general, in sort of larger terms, flip the switch and play with Westerlies.
Yeah.
What do you have to do physically, emotionally to do that?
I mean, physically, any trumpet player will know. Well, actually, I'm jealous because sometimes it feels like maybe this is just a curse on me, but I think every trumpet player feels that way, where it's like you really have to take care of your face. And so that means that tomorrow I'm going to have to take, however I messed up my chops tonight because I was reaching for some sound that I never heard before that I wanted to find, and so I strained my face in some way to go for it. I'm going to take whatever's left and try to reset it and reconfigure it and take it very slow and very patiently. It also means, probably can't catch all the music that's happening tonight after my gig, because there's a physical endurance there as well. But at the same time, I mean, what I feel really lucky about in terms of my work is that I'm able to bring my full self into any situation I'm playing. So the thing that will make the music the best is if it is fully me, rather than trying to perfect an idea of technique that is not my own. And so that's true with the Westerlies, even though we're more in a sort of through composed chamber music context. That's true for my own work, and I try to keep that in mind whenever I jump into anyone else's work as well, that I'm here to be myself rather than to be my idea of someone else's idea of what a trumpet player should sound like.
Or anything. I mean, I feel that way having this conversation with you right now. I mean, I feel that way every time I walk into a situation where what is the voice in our heads? Where's that voice coming from? It's actually not coming from somebody else. It's coming from, I love it, my idea of somebody else's idea of what I'm supposed to sound like.
Yeah.
Or what I should be.
Right. Which is apply that to an interview as well.
Right, of course.
It's like,
of course. But do you so if you were doing 3 Westerlies shows back to back, would it would be a different calculus than doing the Riley show and then the Westerlies the next day because you're playing differently?
Yeah. At the end of the day, there's a sort of just athletic nature to what you're doing. So if you're working the muscles one way, they can sort of get used to that. And so in repertoire, because the Westerlies it's a brass quartet, so it's, there are certain, there's a certain boundary to the dynamic material we might play, just because of the nature of the instrumentation. For what I'm doing tonight, you throw drums into the mix, you throw electronic elements into the mix, it changes the equation pretty drastically. So the muscles have to get used to what is it like to exist in that context. I someday I hope to gather all the trumpet players so we can just commiserate with each other.
Does that not happen? That's not a thing that happens?
It will every once in a while, and especially I will say, if I ever get in over the years, everyone has times where something will happen with their chops and they don't know what's going on. Everyone from me to Wynton Marsalis has had these dips in where all of a sudden it's not working. And so we will call on each other in those moments, go back to our mentors, go back to our teachers, talk to each other about, how are you staying in shape? I was with, a month ago, I was with the trumpet player Jamani Smith, who plays, he has solo stuff of his own. He often plays lead with Harry Connick Jr., Michael Bublé, just unbelievable ability. And so I had 10 minutes with him backstage, and so what I did was pick his brain on, so what do you do every day? What is the thing that you do every day to set yourself up for whatever you're walking into? So it does happen sometimes, but
it's so deep that with all the study of the music and all the education, all the the hallowed halls that you have walked in, and all the conversations about the music, that's not a thing that's getting talked about. You know,
Right.
What are you doing? Because the other thing I think about, and you know, and this applies to you for sure, it's like, you know, life gets lifey. You have a
Right.
family. You
Right.
know, your responsibilities, if you're not on the road, can be pulled in many different directions.
Right.
You have to maintain, you know, a certain level, especially as a brass player. You know, your chops, like, you can't let it down.
Right.
It's a deep thing. It's interesting.
I was telling a story yesterday about after my daughter was born, I was at the hospital with my wife, and, you know, we were so out of it, sleep deprived, you know, still at the hospital. And about a day went by, and then I turned to her and I was like, so I got to go. And she was like, what? I was like, I haven't practiced in 2.5 days, so I just got to dip home real quick, and then I'll be right back. But, you know, I had a gig a week later, and there's, you know, you're just not always free to do it. You
well,
know,
and let that
beholden
precedent
to
be
the-
established early on in the life of the child. Benny Benack told me that he would leave dates to go practice.
Yeah.
This has been great catching up one-on-one with you after our conversation. And
But
I'm so
enough
glad
about me.
But enough about you. Well, I think we can expand
Yeah.
the experience and welcome Chris Pattishall to the
Hey.
to the stage. Let's do this.
You're right here. We've been holding space for you.
Hey, man. I don't think we've ever met before.
We haven't. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
Thank you.
Likewise. I'm a fan of your work and what I know of it. And then in just doing a little brief preparation to meet you, I was delighted to learn that some confluence of Buñuel and Monk unlocked you, that there was something about this, all of the surrealism that you were exposed to in your life that led us to have this conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I had some teachers that were getting me into jazz fairly early on, and I stumbled across Thelonious Monk live at Newport 1963, and I had never heard anything like that. It was like it was clearly a deeply rooted music, but also Monk was managing to elicit sounds out of the instrument that I had never heard and never imagined, and sounded like he was able to kind of break and reassemble the instrument at will. And I was I think hearing that was probably the thing that made me want to be a jazz pianist. Buñuel, this is like kind of random chance, but I had a childhood friend whose parents were academics in the kind of Latin American art world, and I remember seeing Exterminating Angel at like 14, 15 or something, and taking something which maybe at first glance can seem mundane and then finding a way of pulling the rug out from people in a surprising way. To me, Monk is doing the same thing.
I think it's a fantastic connection, and I also think the way you describe Monk as seeming to break and then reassemble. I actually read in your biography where you talk about it seemed like he was able to break it, but maybe I didn't catch the and then reassemble, because that is maybe one of the best descriptions of your production style, is to take source material and open it up and then put it back together. I mean, that's actually something a conclusion I didn't reach when we talked about your record, but that's kind of what I was trying to get to, of how evocative it was, and mysterious and confusing, and what are these sounds? Where is it coming from? And it seems like that goes back to hearing Monk.
Yeah, I think that for me, my relationship to the piano and to music is very close to that experience. Yeah. I spent a lot of time in very kind of traditional training environments. I spent a lot of time wanting to really know how to express a wide range of kind of the conventions of the music. But I think in my heart and in the back of my mind, I was always hoping to find some ways of eventually kind of doing that, breaking things, finding sounds which are maybe not the most, they don't hit you over the head. They're a little liminal. And if someone happens to hear it, then there's a very rich and mysterious world in just those sounds. And so that's something that I try to do on the piano, but also is a big part of my approach to production. And then those two really inform each other back and forth.
Yeah, well, there's a couple ways to go with it. I mean, I want to talk about the piano, the exploration that you did into the conventions of piano. And it's interesting that you say the conventions of piano, because I think you spent time, I was interested to see, studying with someone who is a real proponent and expert in mining the conventions of jazz piano with Marcus Roberts.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, everybody I've ever talked to who spent any time near Wynton said that if you really ask Wynton Marsalis how he wants you to play, he wants you to play like Marcus. That's what he wants from his piano players.
I will tell. I'm not going to name names, but a pianist that is like one of my favorite pianists was doing a set of concerts with Jazz Lincoln Center Orchestra, and he came to me at some point and was like, "Man, like, you know, I don't think I'm quite getting the thing that, you know, like Wynton wants something." And I remember just saying, "Look, with Wynton, if it's piano, just Marcus, you know, just do that." Yeah. And he came back to me, the pianist came back to me the next day and was like, "Man, you were absolutely right. Like, that was it. You know, that solved it."
But it's a deep thing because, I mean, that's a very hard tone to hit. Be like this guy, but also that implies understand everything. Yeah. Because the philosophy is know the whole history and play the whole history as needed. And I always thought that's such a strange, I don't know, conflict or you know, it's a tightrope that you have to walk. Yeah. Finding yourself in all the history.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think Marcus is a great example of someone who has clearly investigated so much of the history, but has an incredibly personal sound.
Yes.
He does not play, to me, you know, if critics have said, "Oh, it just sounds like Scott Joplin or Jelly Roll or whatever," it's like, okay, your ears don't work because this person does not sound like anybody else. Yeah. He has such a unique sound. And also, I think inevitably we all have areas of focus and areas that we haven't maybe touched as much. Yes. And that also shapes what our perspectives are.
Oh yeah, the absence of something is a thing in itself. So, but there is a kind of technical proficiency that you wouldn't necessarily apply the word broken to in that side of what you're describing, like learning how to play clean, learning how to play with articulation and evenly. And then there's another piece of it, which is, you know, choosing to play in a more jagged way or a more unusual way or a staccato way, a pierced way. I don't know. There's a lot of words we could think of.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I learned so much about the piano, about how to practice, about how to a degree of rigor in terms of exploring the music. Yeah. Marcus, of every musician I've met in my life, Marcus is kind of at a high point in terms of an attention to detail, an ability to keep the big picture in his mind, an ability to remember all of the details, an ability to focus super intensely for extreme amounts of time. And I got a lot out of that. But I also I love Cecil Taylor. I love Don Pullen. I love Jerry Allen. I love Jason Moran. Like a lot of other ways of playing that allow me to access hopefully the broadest expressive range that resonates for me.
Yeah. You said something else though that's really interesting. I mean, I have to say, I'm so excited to talk to you because you live in two spaces that I love to spend time thinking about. Part of it is this sort of this jazz conversation and the performance and improvisation. The other is producing. You said this thing that I think about a lot too when it comes to producing, which is if you notice, there's a whole subset of sounds that if you notice them, there's a richness that you can explore. But the implication is plenty of people won't notice them. And I feel like production, which can mean so many things, is the sum of so many small choices. And sometimes I ask myself, as we all do when we're sitting agonizing over a Pro Tools session or whatever, and twisting a knob and adding, automating the reverb or whatever it is, like, does this matter? Is this important? And it's like, no, and totally yes. That each one of these choices will contribute to the experience that somebody has, and yet at the same time, they're all so minute that it's like pointillism. It's like you have to stand back from it to even see did this do anything? I just put that in front of you to see how you respond to it because
I mean I kind of tend to be guided by what moves me. And I definitely can have a tendency to overwork or like potentially overcook, the dish. So I do I'm trying to do better about stopping and taking a step back. But I am not, it doesn't bother me if most listeners don't hear the thing. If one person hears something that strikes them and that they remember and that is meaningful, that's cool. Because also there's a lot of it in there that is doing that for me. Yeah. And I think for Riley and for Rafiq and, if and when it resonates, that's amazing. But also like, I don't know how many people are like listening to albums the way I do, which is like 10,000 times. And when I do that, I'm always hearing something new.
But you can always hear something in a Horace Silver record too. I mean, like that happens regardless of what's happening on these minute, production details. Before we talk about your project together, it is possible, by the way, that more people are listening to records the way you do than we think. I am reminded of this. The first podcast interview I ever did was with Tatum Greenblatt, and he said to me, it's important to have non-musician friends in your life because when they come to your gigs and you hear their feedback, it's not anything that you would have expected. Mm-hmm. They're not listening to any of the things that you thought they were listening to. They're listening to the drum solo or the trading fours or things that are exciting to them that we take as, and I think there's an aspect of that also, which is that people may not be hearing, but they're feeling it in some way. Mm-hmm. I read in your biography also that, and it's not, I don't need to read it to see that you love collaborating, and it's an interesting dynamic because you obviously are a tinkerer and you, as you say, have a tendency to want to cook things a lot, and yet you choose not to do it on your own. That you obviously like the feedback of doing that with somebody else. And interestingly, on your own solo records, they seem less tinkered with. Like the records that you've made tend to be kind of more focused on playing piano.
Yeah. Collaboration for me is always everyone is going to hear things and approach things from a different perspective. And it's one thing with musicians, but even with visual artists and filmmakers and people that are not in the arts, I love those kinds of collaborations because they don't speak the same musical language. You have to find something together. The way that other people imagine music working is unbounded by maybe some constraints that I would take for granted. And so all of a sudden it's like, oh, actually, no, I don't have to conform to any of this. There's a visual artist that I've done a number of projects with, Kambui Olujimi. And the last project we did, we were scoring, it was a short film, and I had prepared a bunch of stuff, and then at some point he was like, I want you to just play something. So I plugged in a keyboard and was playing, and he was kind of pushing me into a space where I was no longer in control. Everything I'd prepared was like, okay, I know exactly, I've EQ'd this just so, and all of a sudden what he was hearing and what he was looking for was a feeling that came when all of a sudden I didn't know what I was doing, and I was like out in the wilderness. And that is so liberating, It gives me a chance to redefine the parameters and the contexts in how I hear music.
Which is, I think, will bring us to the experience of working with Riley, because I think I've talked now a couple of times with Riley about the Riley record, and it became clear as we were talking about it, I think I said this earlier before you got here, that while it is a project that is a totally bespoke, purpose-built thing around Riley, it also was filled with all of this other input that came from you and Rafiq, and that he was in real time responding to what was being fed to him. So in a way, the same idea of breaking open your own concept of what you do is what you then turned onto Riley and had him respond to this set of challenges that he might not have been expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of my favorite moments in the process of making the album were there would be points where Rafiq and I would point to something, a technique or a sound that Riley would do, and we'd say, let's put the magnifying glass on that. This piece of what you're doing is so interesting. Let's really explore the expressive potential of this. And I think as the record was developing, and then we were starting to play some shows, even before the record came out, I remember hearing these things becoming more and more a part of Riley's performing language. It was like as we were experimenting with these things together, it was also changing the direction of how Riley plays.
Yeah. Well, this is what we started to get into, because as I was saying to Riley, when we talked for the podcast, there hadn't been many gigs. And so the question was, well, how's this going to work? And we were talking before you got here about how you live with a record for so long, because it took so long to make, that you end up having a conversation with that record when you get back on stage, but then it develops. Remind me how you guys even started on the record, and had you decided that it was going to be an album when you started, or did you just do one track and to see how it goes?
Yeah, it started. We did know it was going to be a record, and I sort of knew that it was time for me to figure out what it was that I wanted to say in an album format, and that's a very daunting thing to go on. And most of my work, as we were talking about, up until that point had been collaborative with the Westerlies or with other groups, where I sort of took for granted how much easier it is when you're working with other people, bounce things off. There's a momentum that builds, and then when it's just you, at the very beginning, there's very little momentum. So I knew I needed to find someone that could sort of go on this journey with me. And Chris, at that point, we're talking, 2016, 2017, 2018.
2016. I mean, that's 9 years ago.
Jeez. But at that point, we had gone on this journey together where we met at Dizzy's at Jazz Lincoln Center, playing these jam sessions. I was, a disciple of Wynton. Chris was a disciple of Marcus Roberts, like we were just talking about. And so we would play songs like King Porter Stomp, songs that Marcus and Wynton played all the time. And we had that DNA, in us so deeply. And then we started getting more in the studio on Chris's record, on some of Rafiq's projects. And for me...
what was the record that you got on that you first did together? On your
I think
record?
It was Zodiac.
It was Zodiac.
Yeah.
Record,
and Rafiq was producing that, so that was, you know, an opportunity for me to see how the language that they have, which I had never encountered before. So long story short, Chris was the first person that I called once I had gotten together a rough idea of some of the songs or some of the ideas that I had for the record. And then once we started talking, we brought Rafiq into the conversation, and then it was still a long period of just like going on walks, playing and recording ourselves, listening back, trying to break things like we were just saying. And that process of just allowing the ideas to marinate a little bit before jumping into anything turned out to be very valuable.
Are you, I mean, thinking about playing King Porter Stomp at jam sessions, 9 years of swimming in this pool, and then having to go out and play it, getting to go out and play it, revisiting it. Are you tired of the repertoire? Did you add? I mean, I haven't seen this show. Like, is the repertoire changing?
A lot of the repertoire right now is very directly from the record. But no, we're not tired of it because we haven't gotten
Really
to do it
played
live that much. I mean, the past year has been so great, but also, as any musician knows, you know, to put together touring opportunities, to put together live performance is no small lift. So that's what we're in right now. Is, you know, the next step of this record is sharing it with people in live spaces and having that conversation.
I think we talked about this last time too, about how, you know, there's a version of the sort of the jazz record business cycle where you know, every year you make a record, you know, and you go in with some players, and you might be some tunes, and maybe we brought some tunes in. And this is not that. Mm-hmm. This is like totally the opposite of that. This is, you are settling into this. You're like living with this. You like, you know, you're domestic partners with with this thing. Yeah. So it's a huge commitment. You had to really commit yourselves to this project. And Chris, you also, I mean, you have a lot of other things that you're doing. So how is it for you? I mean, clearly you're committed to this project, but this is only one of many things that you're doing.
Yeah, I actually find, while it can be frustrating just how long things take, I find that it is very stimulating to be able to, it's like, we'll work on this for 2 weeks, and then I'll go work on something else for 2 weeks. And that keeps new information coming in. It keeps things from getting stale. It allows me a chance to step away and come back with some fresh perspective. I think with Riley's record, a lot of it was sort of like chipping away at a block of marble and trying to see what the shape was. And I think we benefited from taking time. I mean, we did like at our first session, we did a version of King Porter Stomp that eventually, several months later, we just said, look, this isn't it. We got to try this. We got to rethink this. And we, at several points, like, decided to go back to the drawing board. I think that there are a lot of wonderful things about the way that most jazz musicians record, you know, how jazz albums are. I've been in so many situations where everyone, especially if it's an independent project, it's like you're so stressed, you're watching the clock, you're like, can we record a whole album in 1 day? And there's something to be said for that, but giving ourselves the permission to say, no, actually, let's revisit this completely, I think was what allowed it.
Yeah, I think that also speaks to the word that you used earlier, which was conventions. Like, there are conventions around often, less and less, I think, but conventions around jazz records. And I love the conventions of great sounding jazz records. I love Rudy Van Gelder's records. I love James Farber's records. I love a well-recorded jazz record is a wonderful thing, and there's a lot of personality and a lot of identity that you find in them. But we forget, I think, that those conventions developed out of somebody's choices. And then the rest of us kind of started to copy those choices. I think maybe I said this to you when we first talked, like when I heard the early Bad Plus records that Chad Blake made, I was completely freaked out and angry at first. Like when I first heard them, I was upset about the drum sound. And then something switched and it was so liberating. Oh, it could be that. What we talked about on the Riley record was the amount of sub bass information that I was receiving at first, and I said, "Oh, it sounds like a Phineas mix. Like that's what I compared it to."
Yeah.
Because I have a 13-year-old daughter. We're listening to Billie Eilish in my house all the time, and I thought she would hear this record and think that there's something sonically in it that's for her, even if musically she doesn't relate to it. She would understand in the sound that this is speaking her sonic language. So you broke some of the conventions of the way jazz records sound.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like there's trade-offs. There's all kinds of things that modern technology affords us. I mean, even just not to totally geek out, but like
no, please.
Digital recording formats allow for a lot more frequency information under 100 hertz. That does not translate on vinyl. You know, it's not it as the technology has evolved. The actual range of the audible spectrum that we can access has expanded. At the same time, it's like you can't have like a fast walking bass line and get that kind of same sub frequency information. That kind of note needs some time just for the actual sound wave to travel. So it's a trade-off. And then I think we're also like, we're always, you know, if we're playing a jazz club, they might not have the setup to realize some of those sounds.
Or they might be freaked out. But I mean, so when you played in my hometown of Madison and you played at the North Street Cabaret, I don't know if you told me this or my father, who was in the audience, told me. Somebody told me that the system had been revamped for the show, or that you had brought in that something had happened and that there was all this bottom happening in the room that, as somebody who goes to that club a lot, he had not experienced in that room before.
Yeah, I you know, and one thing in the live situations that we've really understood that the sound is part of the music and part of the show. So, like for that show, when we were on the road, we brought with us a front of house engineer, the wonderful Emily Canino, and so she was part of the band. You know, she knew the set, she knew the sounds, and she was riding all those ebbs and flows throughout the set. And so hopefully the dream is that we can walk into any space. And I love when it's a jazz club where people would be expecting it even less.
Yeah.
And we get to try to create that universe that we found on the record and be in conversation with that live.
Yes. I think it's really, I mean, are you finding other people that are thinking in these terms? Is there a community of people that are working in this way?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I was just downstairs. I ran into Casa Overall, who's, you know, I used to go hear him play when he was in high school.
Did you see his
I haven't
baby?
I haven't seen Seneca run around yet. Probably not run. I think you know, it's 6 or 7 months, but I'm really happy for them. But there are people who are doing this, and for me, I mean, I'm very new to this, and Chris and Rafiq sort of, you know, held my hand and shepherded me through this process of opening up my ears in these ways. But as Chris said, it's so fun because then we can take these things that we find and we can put them in acoustic, we can reinterpret them acoustically, and it changes the language that we use to express whatever we want to say.
Is it too soon to ask, do you want to make another one?
I'm so glad you asked that, because we were just talking about commitment, right? Yeah. And it's no small thing. It's like, I don't take for granted that Chris and Rafiq dedicated years of their life to making this happen and seeing this music through. And you know, they're two of my best friends, but that doesn't mean that I expect them to dedicate another half decade of their life. But Chris and I, you know, we had a very candid conversation the other day. I was like, I have all these ideas for how we can continue the language of this music, and I want to realize them with Chris, because I feel like we scratched the surface on what we discovered on the last record, and we're together really excited about what that next statement can be. But it's never a given, just because it takes serious commitment to each other, and it's like you were saying earlier about life getting lifey. It's about navigating all that stuff while prioritizing each other and this work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I heard an interview the other day with Sarah Bareilles, who works in musical theater.
Radio Hour, New York.
Yes, they just ran it the other day. And she said this thing about writing for musical theater, which was, it's great if you are not attached to the outcome of any given day of work, meaning you have to just be willing to revisit it and throw it away and let it be iterative. And if you're okay with that, then it's wonderful. But if you're a person who is, results oriented, it can be very frustrating. It seems like you have to surrender to that in a project like this, and just surrender to the process.
Yeah, I think so. I have a friend who, when he was getting married, he was talking about this idea of commitment, as probably anyone is thinking about when they go into a marriage. And he said something I love, which was that commitment breeds purpose. And I think that, in the commitment to this work, we find purpose. And that becomes the thing that drives us. And we're at our best if we're honoring that. And so, you can find it in a marriage, but you can also find it in a working relationship.
In a working relationship, sure. Well, and commitment also to the craft and what we're doing. I mean, it reminds me of this thing my dad always says, which is, if you spend your life blowing through a copper tube, at the end, the copper tube is unchanged and you have been transformed. That the commitment that brings the purpose, that's the purpose that's transforming you, and the commitment brings that transformation, which is interesting. Like that's what we're talking about, is committing ourselves to the work, and that it's important to do it.
Right.
Riley Mulherkar, Chris Pattishall, you guys play at 8 o'clock tonight?
8:30.
8:30. But we should say 8 so people are there on time.
Yeah, you know how it gets. Yeah.
What do we, I mean, we can keep going. There's no rules here. What should we talk? I mean, there's a lot to talk with Chris about. There's a lot to talk about the two of you.
Yeah.
Man, I mean, I understand that a lot of your work is patient or whatever, but it does seem, I don't understand how your life is organized that you get all these projects done.
It's sometimes very long hours. Sometimes one thing that I'm not always good about is stopping and taking care of.
This is the rudest thing I've ever done. You're talking, and I just checked we're right on time.
Amazing
to be having this conversation right now.
Yeah. My wife at several points has said, look, you got to step away. Like, you need to take a break and cook dinner or go to the gym and get some exercise. I definitely have a kind of personality where I can get pretty intense tunnel vision with some of this work. I also, though, find it really, like I said, it's really stimulating to jump from one thing to another for me. I was just meeting with someone earlier today. I'm producing a record for them. My involvement in that is very much like hands-on, making the sounds, arranging things, sound design, synths, writing. I'm producing a different record where I didn't learn any of the music. As a pianist, I tend to approach things and be like, what is every single chord? What is this? What is that? It's a rock record, and I was like, I'm not even going to learn. I don't want to know what the chords are. I want to just hear it from like a very different perspective and just listen and respond that way. I'm just got done writing a draft of some string arrangements for a tour I'm doing with Vuyo Sotache, an incredible string ensemble called Palaver. They're based up in Portland, Maine, and I'm writing string arrangements for that. And
I was going to ask you about this project with Vuyo because I discovered them through the Riley record, and then I just saw that you had done this duo project together.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's something more that wants to happen with that project.
There are things in the works. Can't comment definitively yet, but there is. We were in residence at Joe's Pub, and so we did a number of performances. We've been working on some music. We put out one single, They Say I Look Like God, which comes from the Real Ambassadors, Dave Brubeck. We also did a cover of Easy by Sun Lux on an album that they put out of sort of alternate reimaginings of their music.
Yep.
And we do have some more stuff coming up, and we're going to do this tour in March of all South African music. So Vuyo will be singing in Xhosa and Zulu and Sebedi, and it's going to be really, really special.
You also worked on this soundtrack project with Samora Pinder-Hughes this year, the documentary score. The documentary won an Emmy?
Yeah, Going to Mars won an Emmy back in September.
And the music was nominated for some awards also?
Yeah, for International Documentary Association and Cinema Eye, which is another kind of documentary-focused organization.
International Documentary Association, the coveted IDA award.
Exactly.
That everybody wants to have on their shelf.
Exactly. Yeah, so the score was nominated for that. And yeah, Samora and I have scored a number of projects together. The first thing we did, I did some work for an art installation he was doing, and I honestly feel like maybe that was Riley's doing. Like, I think Rafiq and I were working on Riley's record, and then we saw Samora somewhere, and he was like, "I got this thing. I need y'all to get on this."
Because I'm just more old school in a way. Like I am very impressed by the multidisciplinary aspect of what you guys do. We talked about the theater work that you had done with Anna DeVere Smith at one point, that you've done installations, art stuff, that it's like the container is much wider than this is a record or this is a single or you guys are making work that can live in a lot of different spaces. It seems like not only is that a creatively very satisfying thing to do, but probably a really strategically very smart thing to do, given the nature of the business right now and the world that we're in.
I mean, that's real. The one thing I'll say, I'm gonna hand it to Riley, but I think at least in our time, in our kind of awareness, I think it's safe to say that a big reference point and inspiration is Jason Moran. And obviously I think there are precedents that go back before that, but Jason and the way that he showed all of us in our generation and beyond these kind of other opportunities and other ways that we could still be creative and engage with our practice, but find different spaces, find different collaborators. That, I think, at least for me, it like opened up the mold. It was like, okay, this is wide open now.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to see, in my early years in New York, going to see Jason at Roulette with the performance artist Joan Jonas, and seeing them work together. And it was one of those nights that just blows your mind, where it's like there's before and then there's after, because I didn't know half of what I was seeing, but I knew how it made me feel, and I knew that, some preconception or notion of what I thought the constraints were had just been moved further. Yeah. So we definitely take a lot of inspiration from mentors like that.
Guys, I am such a fan of what you are doing, and I'm so excited for the success. I said to Riley when we spoke last year, it was before the record came out, and I feel like it was met with the enthusiasm that you would hope for, and I wish you both all the success, continued success.
Thank you, Leo. We are big fans of you too.
Thanks, gentlemen.